Washington, D.C., a federal office building. September 1960, a folder lands on a desk. Inside it is an application to sell a new drug in the United States. The drug is called thalidomide. The brand name proposed for the American market is Kevadon. The application was submitted by the William S. Merrill Company. The woman whose desk it landed on has been working at the FDA for 7 months. Her name is Frances Oldham Kelsey. She looks at the folder. She opens it. She starts reading. Something does not sit right. She does not know it yet, but the folder on her desk contains the only thing standing between the United States and a disaster that has already begun in 12 countries across Europe, Africa, and Asia. She does not approve it. Not that day. Not that month. Not ever. Thalidomide had been developed in West Germany in the early 1950s by the pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal. It was marketed as a sedative with a remarkable claim attached to it. It was said to be essentially impossible to overdose on. Unlike barbiturates, which could be lethal in excess, thalidomide appeared to have no toxic ceiling in animal studies. This made it enormously appealing. In the late 1950s, barbiturate overdose, accidental and intentional, was a significant public health concern. A sleeping pill that you could not die from seemed like a genuine advance. By 1957, thalidomide was available without a prescription in West Germany. Within a few years, Grünenthal had licensed the drug to 14 pharmaceutical companies in 46 countries. It was sold under at least 37 different brand names. People took it for insomnia, for anxiety, for colds and flu, and, increasingly, for the nausea of early pregnancy. It seemed like a miracle drug. It was not. Frances Kelsey had not been looking for thalidomide. She had taken the FDA job in Washington partly because her husband had taken a position in the city and she needed work. She was 46 years old. She had a doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Chicago and a medical degree. She had been trained by Eugene Geiling, a noted pharmacologist who had worked on the safety testing of sulfanilamide, the drug that had killed more than 100 Americans in 1937 due to a toxic solvent and had prompted the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. She understood what it meant when drug safety data was inadequate. She had seen what happened when the question was not asked. When the thalidomide application crossed her desk in September 1960, it was her first major case. Under the rules that existed in 1960, a drug company could submit an application and, if the FDA had not formally rejected it within 60 days, the drug could go to market. The burden of proof was not on the manufacturer to demonstrate safety. The FDA had to demonstrate danger in order to block approval. Kelsey read the application. She was not satisfied. The clinical data submitted was largely from European doctors. She had concerns about whether European trial data met American standards. She was concerned about reports of peripheral neuritis, a painful tingling in the hands and feet associated with long-term thalidomide use. And she had a specific, focused concern that the application did not address. She wanted to know if thalidomide could cross the placenta, if a drug could pass from a mother's bloodstream into a developing fetus. The safety profile for a pregnant woman was not the same as the safety profile for anyone else. She did not see adequate data on this point. She requested more information. The clock on the 60-day window reset. The Merrill Company was not pleased. Thalidomide was already a successful drug in Europe. The American market was large and lucrative. Every month of delay was lost revenue. The company contacted Kelsey directly. Then it contacted her supervisors. Company representatives described her as being an obstructionist. They complained that she was applying unreasonable standards. They called her a petty bureaucrat. Her supervisor at the FDA, Ralph Smith, told her the complaints were not unusual. He told her to hold her position if she believed she was right. She believed she was right. She requested more information again. The Merrill Company resubmitted. She requested more information again. This went on for more than a year. While Kelsey was holding the line in Washington, something was happening in Europe that she did not yet fully know about. In the autumn of 1961, a pediatrician in Hamburg named Widukind Lenz was noticing something. He was seeing an unusual number of babies born with a condition called phocomelia. Phocomelia is a birth defect so rare that it barely appears in most medical textbooks. The word means seal limb. It describes a condition in which the long bones of the arms or legs are absent or severely shortened. In severe cases, hands and feet emerge directly from the torso. Phocomelia was so uncommon that before 1960, pediatricians in most countries went entire careers without seeing a single case. Lenz was seeing dozens. He began interviewing the mothers. He asked about everything they had taken during their pregnancies. One question produced a pattern. Many of them had taken thalidomide. Lenz notified Chemie Grunenthal on November 16, 1961. He told them the drug was causing birth defects. Grunenthal pulled thalidomide from the West German market on November 26, 1961. The British distributor followed on December 2nd. More than 10,000 babies had already been born with birth defects caused by thalidomide. The drug had been on the market for 5 years. Kelsey had read a letter in the British Medical Journal in February 1961, months before the phocomelia connection was publicly confirmed. The letter described peripheral neuritis in long-term thalidomide users. Something about it troubled her. A simple sedative should not be producing nerve damage with long-term use. If the drug was doing something to the peripheral nervous system, what else might it be doing? What might it be doing to a fetus whose nervous system was still developing? She wrote in her files that the side effect did not seem like the sort of thing that should come from a simple sleeping pill. She kept asking for more data. The Merrill Company told her that the neuritis was caused by inadequate diet or vitamin deficiencies in the patients who reported it. Her team was not impressed. Meanwhile, unknown to Kelsey, Merrill had already distributed 2.5 million thalidomide pills to more than 1,000 American doctors as part of what the company called clinical trials. The trials were not supervised. The doctors were not required to monitor outcomes systematically. The patients were not always told they were receiving an experimental drug. Approximately 20,000 Americans had taken thalidomide by the time the drug was withdrawn from European markets. Of those, approximately 207 were pregnant. 17 American babies were born with thalidomide-caused birth defects. In Germany, the number was more than 2,500. In the United Kingdom, more than 400. Across the countries where the drug had been fully approved, the total exceeded 10,000. The Washington Post published a long article about Frances Kelsey on July 15, 1962. The article described how she had spent more than a year refusing to approve a drug that had already been causing devastating birth defects across Europe. The public reaction was immediate. Congress moved fast. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee had already been working for more than 2 years on legislation to strengthen drug regulation. He had been chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly and had been conducting hearings on pharmaceutical industry practices. His reform proposals had stalled. Congress had shown little interest. The thalidomide story changed everything. The hearings that followed produced testimony from Helen Taussig, a pediatrician from Johns Hopkins Hospital who had traveled to Europe and seen the thalidomide babies firsthand. She testified about what she had witnessed. The testimony moved the room. On October 2, 1962, both houses of Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment unanimously. President John F. Kennedy signed it into law 8 days later on October 10th. Kennedy had awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service in August of that year, the highest honor available to a federal civilian employee. She was the second woman ever to receive it. What the Kefauver-Harris Amendment did was fundamental. Before the amendment, drug companies had to show that a drug was safe. After the amendment, drug companies had to show that a drug was both safe and effective. Before the amendment, the FDA had 60 days to act on an application, or the drug could proceed to market. After the amendment, the FDA had to affirmatively approve a drug before it could be sold. Before the amendment, clinical trials in the United States were not required. After the amendment, drug manufacturers had to provide data from highly regulated trials in humans conducted in the United States. Before the amendment, patients in clinical trials were not required to give informed consent. After the amendment, informed consent was mandatory. Before the amendment, pharmaceutical companies were not required to report adverse effects from their drugs. After the amendment, they were required to report adverse reactions to the FDA. Former FDA Commissioner David Kessler later wrote that with the passage of the amendments, the FDA was no longer a helpless bystander, while unproven medicines were streaming into pharmacies and onto patients' bedside tables. The Washington Post had credited Kelsey's stubbornness and skepticism for preventing what could have been an appalling American tragedy. She had not set out to change American drug law. She had set out to get adequate data, to make a decision she was being paid to make. She never got adequate data. She never approved the drug. Kelsey served at the FDA for 45 years after the thalidomide case. She worked on the regulations for clinical trials. She worked on the protections for participants in research. She worked on the oversight systems that governed how drugs were tested and evaluated. The historian Daniel Carpenter wrote that the standard history of the FDA is often divided into two eras: before thalidomide and after Kelsey. That framing is accurate. The drug approval process that exists in the United States today, the process that requires extensive animal testing, well-monitored human clinical trials, informed consent for participants, mandatory reporting of adverse effects, and affirmative FDA approval before any drug reaches the market, traces its existence directly to the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962. And the Kefauver-Harris Amendment traces its existence directly to the 13 months that Frances Kelsey spent refusing to approve a drug that was already on pharmacy shelves across 12 countries. She was asked later what she had been thinking during those 13 months. She said she had not been thinking about stopping the drug. She had been thinking about getting the information she needed to make a decision. She never got the information. She never made the decision. She never approved the drug. The thalidomide babies who were born in Europe and in other countries where the drug had been approved grew up in a world that had been changed by what had happened to them. In Germany, the United Kingdom, and other affected countries, advocacy organizations were formed. Legal battles lasted for decades. Settlements were reached. In Germany, Chemie Grunenthal provided a settlement in 1970. It was considered inadequate by many survivors. The company issued a formal apology in 2012, more than 50 years after withdrawing the drug. The Thalidomide Society in the United Kingdom continues to advocate for survivors. The original survivors are now in their 60s. In the United States, the 17 Americans born with thalidomide-caused birth defects had a different experience than their European counterparts. They were part of a much smaller group. They had been born because the drug had been distributed here without formal approval, not because it had been authorized for sale. The reason there were 17 rather than thousands was that a pharmacologist in Washington had kept asking for more data. The current drug approval process in the United States is long, expensive, and often criticized for being slow. The average time from initial drug development to FDA approval is more than 10 years. The cost of bringing a new drug to market is measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. These costs and timelines are not without consequence. They affect which drugs get developed. They affect when treatments reach patients. They are a real limitation. But the framework that produces those timelines, the requirement for proof, the requirement for clinical data, the requirement for informed consent, the requirement for reporting of adverse effects, was built from the lesson of what happened in the countries that did not have Frances Kelsey. More than 10,000 families, more than 10,000 births, more than 10,000 sets of parents who had taken what appeared to be a safe and effective sedative. The drug approval system that exists today in the United States is imperfect, but it required the companies that wanted to sell drugs to prove their case. Before October 10th, 1962. They did not have to. After that date, they did. One reviewer, 13 months. One question she never stopped asking. What happens to the baby? She never got an answer she was satisfied with. She never approved the drug. And the law that came from her refusal is still asking that question today on behalf of every patient who has ever taken a drug prescribed by a doctor who trusted the process to have checked. The folder landed on her desk in September 1960. She opened it. Something did not sit right. She was right. Frances Oldham Kelsey died on August 7th, 2015. She was 101 years old. She had spent 45 years at the FDA after the thalidomide case. She had trained a generation of reviewers. She had helped write regulations that are still in force. The Opana radar site on the north shore of Oahu is a National Historic Landmark because the men there detected the Pearl Harbor attack. Frances Kelsey is the reason that American drug approval works the way it does. Her desk is not a landmark, but the process she defended, the standard she refused to abandon, the question she kept asking, is in every FDA office in the United States. Every drug approved since 1962 had to answer her question. Every drug rejected since 1962 was rejected because it could not. The folder is still opening. The question is still being asked. What happens to the baby? The world that existed before the Kefauver-Harris Amendment was a different world for anyone taking medication. Under the rules that applied before October 1962, a pharmaceutical company submitting a drug application to the FDA was not required to prove that the drug worked. It was required to show that the drug was safe. But safe was a flexible standard. The data used to demonstrate safety could come from animal studies. It could come from clinical observations by physicians who had been given the drug to distribute. It could come from foreign clinical data gathered under different standards. It did not have to come from controlled clinical trials in the United States. It did not have to include informed consent from patients. It did not have to include systematic monitoring of outcomes. The FDA had 60 days to act. If it did not formally reject the application in 60 days, the drug could go to market. This was the world Frances Kelsey entered in the spring of 1960. She had come from academic pharmacology. She had been trained to ask hard questions about data. She had been trained by someone who had been involved in the aftermath of the sulfanilamide disaster of 1937, in which a company had used a toxic solvent to dissolve a drug and more than 100 people had died as a result. She knew what it looked like when the data was not adequate. She knew what it meant to skip the question. When she read the thalidomide application in September 1960, the data was not adequate. She asked her question. They told her the drug was safe. She said, "Prove it." That was the entirety of her contribution to American regulatory history. That was all she did. She kept saying, "Prove it." The 13 months that Kelsey spent saying no while Merrill kept resubmitting are worth understanding in detail. September 1960. Application received. Kelsey reviews. Kelsey requests more information. Clock resets. January 1961. Merrill resubmits. Kelsey requests more information. Clock resets. February 1961. Kelsey reads the British Medical Journal letter about peripheral neuritis. Her concerns deepen. She is now asking about both the neuritis data and the placenta question. March 1961. Merrill resubmits. Merrill representatives complain about Kelsey to her supervisors. Her supervisors tell her to hold her position if she is right. Summer 1961. Widukind Lenz in Hamburg begins tracking the phocomelia cases. Nobody in Washington knows yet. November 16th, 1961. Lenz notifies Grunenthal that thalidomide is causing birth defects. November 26th, 1961. Grunenthal withdraws thalidomide from German market. December 2nd, 1961. British distributor withdraws. The news reaches the United States slowly. Communications in 1961 move through newspapers and medical journals. There is no instant information transfer, but the withdrawal from European markets is reported. Kelsey reads it. She had been right. The data she had been asking for, the data she had never received in adequate form, would have shown what Lenz had found. The drug crossed the placenta. The drug was devastating to the developing fetus during a specific window of early pregnancy, between 20 and 37 days after conception. At that stage of fetal development, the thalidomide molecule interfered with the development of limb bones. Hands and feet formed where arms and legs should have grown. All of this was knowable. The animal testing protocols that existed in 1960, applied rigorously, would have shown it, but the animal studies submitted with the application had not used pregnant animals in adequate numbers or at the right stage of development. Kelsey had been asking for more data. The data, if properly gathered, would have answered the question. She never got the data. The drug never got approved. March 1962. Merrill formally withdrew its FDA application. The withdrawal came 4 months after thalidomide had been pulled from European markets. It came because the case against the drug was now public and overwhelming. But it also came because the FDA had still not approved the application. 13 months after the first submission, after multiple resubmissions, after sustained pressure on Kelsey and complaints about her to her supervisors, after the Merrill Company had already distributed 2.5 million thalidomide pills to more than 1,000 American doctors under the guise of clinical trials, the application was withdrawn because Frances Kelsey had never approved it. The doctor who identified the problem in Europe was William McBride, an Australian obstetrician practicing in Sydney. He had noticed that several patients who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy had delivered babies with severe birth defects. He wrote a letter to The Lancet, the British medical journal, published in December 1961. The letter was short. It asked a question. It suggested that thalidomide might be causing the birth defects he was observing. The letter sent a shock wave through the medical community. Grunenthal had already withdrawn the drug from Germany. The British distributor had already followed. But McBride's letter in The Lancet was the moment the scientific community formally began the process of confirming what Lenz had been tracking. McBride received the Kennedy Foundation Award for Intellectual Achievement and the French title Commander of the National Order of Merit for his work. He later became a prominent advocate for testing drugs in pregnant animals before human trials. His advocacy led directly to the adoption of that standard in drug testing protocols worldwide. The FDA had approximately 260 employees working on drug review in 1960. Frances Kelsey was one of them. She had no particular authority that distinguished her from her colleagues. She was a new employee. She had been on the job for 7 months when the thalidomide application arrived. What she had was a question she would not stop asking. And supervisors who, when the pressure from the Merrill company became intense, told her to hold her position if she believed she was right. Dr. Ralph Smith, her supervisor, was one of the people who told her to stand firm. He is less well known than Kelsey, but his role in telling a new employee under external pressure that the FDA would back her judgment was essential to what followed. The institution held, not because it was designed to be heroic, because the people in it, in that specific case, at that specific moment, made the decision to keep asking the question that needed to be asked. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment was not the only legacy of the thalidomide case. It also produced lasting changes in how clinical trials are conducted. Before the amendment, pharmaceutical companies could conduct what amounted to uncontrolled distribution under the label of clinical trials. The 2.5 million pills Merrill had distributed to more than 1,000 American doctors were described as a clinical trial. Most of the doctors kept no systematic records. Most of the patients did not know they were in a trial. After the amendment, clinical trials required FDA oversight. They required protocols established in advance. They required systematic collection of data. They required informed consent from participants. They required reporting of adverse events. These changes transformed the practice of clinical medicine in the United States. The randomized controlled trial, which is now the foundation of evidence-based medicine, gained its central institutional position in the American medical system, in part because the regulations that followed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment required the kind of evidence that only a well-designed trial can produce. Every treatment that has been proven effective through a randomized controlled trial since 1962 stands on a foundation that includes the 13 months Frances Kelsey spent refusing to approve a drug without adequate data. The question she kept asking was simple. She wanted to know if the drug was safe for pregnant women. That question had not been answered. The animal data was insufficient. The human data from Europe was not gathered under adequate conditions. The reports of peripheral neuritis raised concerns about what the drug might be doing systemically. The placenta question had not been addressed. The question sounds obvious now. In 1960, it was not a question that drug approvals systematically required an answer to. Pregnant women were not routinely included in clinical trials. They were often excluded, precisely because of concerns about risks to the fetus. But exclusion from trials meant exclusion from data. And exclusion from data meant that if a drug caused harm during pregnancy, the harm would only be detected after the drug was on the market and pregnant women had already taken it. Kelsey understood this. She had been trained as a pharmacologist. She understood that absence of data was not evidence of safety. She kept asking. They could not answer. The drug was never approved. The amendment that followed required every subsequent drug applicant to answer the question before, not after, the drug reached the market. That is the world we live in now, built from one question, asked for 13 months, never answered, never approved. Frances Kelsey opened the folder in September 1960. Something did not sit right. She was right about what did not sit right. She was right to keep asking. She was right to hold. The folder that opens on an FDA reviewer's desk today carries a different requirement than the one that arrived on her desk in 1960. It must prove the drug works. It must prove the drug is safe. It must include data from controlled clinical trials. It must include informed consent. It must report adverse effects. And it must answer the question that Frances Kelsey kept asking. What happens to the baby? The question is still there. The requirement to answer it is law. The folder is still opening. The answer is still required. One reviewer, One question, 13 months, and a law that has been protecting patients since the 10th of October, 1962. She was 101 years old when she died. 45 years at the FDA. One question that changed the law. One folder she never approved. The world is different because she opened it.